So we kind of left off here, right, where we were doing texture painting. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out that we could do is, of course, we have the material preview on, right? And if you go to the little V here, you can actually turn scene lights on, right? And once you turn scene lights on, you can actually go to the light right here, right? There's actually a light already in your scene right here, right? So I could easily click on that light, turn the eyeball on, and you see you can actually see the effect now on the screen because we have material preview on, and we went to scene lights, right? Remember, there's a little V kind of next to these balls, right there, and you can turn scene lights on, right? In this case, you'll see when I click on the light and I turn the eyeball back on, particularly on the properties menu right here, right? Because this is our outliner. This is the properties menu right here. You'll see that there's an actual, your kind of green icon down here turns into a light bulb icon, right? And that means you can control your light, right? Now, in this case, for us, it'll just be easy to kind of do some quick sunlight for the scene. And normally I would kind of put in more of like a normal like a sky background, but I feel like that's a little bit more complicated. I want you guys to do it for this first project, so we'll just do some simple lighting, kind of put a floor in for the character. But if I turn the sunlight on, right, you can see now all of a sudden we're seeing the lighting in the viewport, and that's pretty intense, right? So you could switch your point light to a sun, which is a directional light. Now, you'll notice that, because like I said, there's the kind of green light bulb icon here when you select the light, so it is an object, right? The properties will change here. The strength's way too high, so I'm going to set that to maybe like 20. And then you'll see that's more normal, but you see how we actually have some shadow casting on the scene, particularly if we go to the eyeball here and we kind of turn this on, right? That'll kind of usually show kind of some lighting stuff going on. Now, of course, we can hit E for rotate and do middle mouse button view rotate to kind of rotate this sun more in a direction we want. You can also grab on this little kind of yellow dot to kind of visually move it as well. I find that it's a little bit more reliable for me just to hit E for rotate and use middle mouse button for view rotate. But you see how even with Eevee on, right, your material preview, you actually could get a pretty cool idea of what's going on in your scene. In fact, you can even go to your kind of little, it's kind of right below the white screwdriver, white wrench. Kind of looks like a microwave briefcase, right? Kind of the one below it looks like a printer printing an image. But there's kind of that second one down. It kind of looks like a little bit like a microwave briefcase or something like that. And you'll see it's using a rendering engine Eevee. Now, what's one of the cool things, you can actually turn bloom on, right? And you can even turn on screen space reflections just to have your reflections on your metals look a little bit better in viewport and rendering. And you can even open up bloom. And so it kind of just gives it this kind of like slightly brighter effect on your scene. And you can kind of see it in here. Usually to get the full bloom effect, you'd have to composite it in. But like I said, I want to keep this first one simpler. We'll do a slightly more advanced render for our next project. So you can leave bloom off if you want to for this one, right? But it is kind of a cool way to kind of get the brighter pixels on metals or even glows to show up a lot better. So remember, rendering engine set to Eevee right now. And that's fine because I want to put a floor in really quick, and then I want to kind of put do a little bit of a pose. But you can see we've already got kind of a main light. W for move, right? So you see it's selected so you can move it, rotate it, all that good stuff to kind of get the exact angle you like for the lighting. But in this case, I kind of feel like I need a bit of a floor, right? So I'm going to go back to modeling, right? Modeling viewport. And I'm going to go to add mesh, right? So if we go back to the modeling workspace, we can go to add, right? Because we're in object mode, right? 4 for object mode. If you're selecting an object and you hit 3, you notice how you kind of you have add here, but it'll add it kind of already what exists. We don't necessarily want that. So 4 for object mode. That way I can just go to add mesh, and I'm going to put a plane in, right? And you'll now notice there's now a new object, plane. Now I'm going to hit R for scale to scale it up. Middle mouse button, right? Remember, middle mouse button will do your uniform scale. I'll hit W for move, and I'll move it down a bit. There we go. R for scale, middle mouse button, right? We just kind of get ourselves a nice little plane here. Like I say, we're going to kind of try to keep this render as simple as possible, just get enough bounce and light to render a picture out with shadows. Like I said, we'll do kind of a more advanced one with skylight for our next project, but you know, this is our intro project, so we'll keep the lighting and rendering a bit simpler as a starter. But we do want a floor, right? It's a good place to have a floor for the creature to stand on. For portfolios, you see some people kind of create these little pedestals that the character or creature will stand on, and that's fine too. We're just trying to keep it simple and straightforward. It's always good for the character to be standing someplace, right? So for us, just add mesh plane, and that just drops in a grid, right? Really just a single big polygon. And we just move and scale it wherever we want to. Now, if you wanted to do a little bit of posing, right, you can select the body. We can go to sculpting, right? There is an actual brush in sculpting right here. It's kind of in the yellows, called pose, right? Like I said, pose. I'll need your green check also, of course. So pose brush is kind of cool, right? Because we can go to our wrench screwdriver. And that'll bring up the options for it, right? Now, like I said, posing is one of those things, if you want to do it, cool. If you don't, hey, I figured it's pretty easy just to do minor changes here. By default, the pose brush is kind of set to use topology, rotate, twist, right, instead of face sets. And that's fine. But our brackets, right, we can make our bracket bigger, right? Right and left bracket, that's your radius size. And you'll see what you could do then is you can actually just grab and kind of move, right? So the bigger your brush is, the more you can kind of move it out. Now this is kind of using just one IK segment, right? So if you're just trying to do some really broad kind of pose changes, you can do that. If you make your brush size smaller though, and you actually turn up your pose IK segments a little bit to say like 3, you'll see what it does is it kind of actually puts in a couple more joints. Maybe I'll even try like 5, right? And of course your brush size kind of determines how much of an effect. And you see how you can kind of get more of like an actual bending to this. So you can easily just kind of do, a little bit of posing if you want to here and there. Might be fun to kind of try it out a little bit just to kind of see how far you could push it. You can also use the actual deformation to be scale translate, right? And that can kind of do some neat stuff as well for you. It's kind of do a scaling first. If you hold down Control, it'll allow you to kind of move. So you can kind of stretch your leg out a little bit there if you want to. And then, of course, you can switch back to rotate, twist. And, of course, like I said, you can kind of make your brush size smaller. And that'll affect less of it, right? You can turn your IK segments up or down. And it's just one of those things that lets you kind of do a little bit of posing to your creature, right? So you might find it kind of neat to just do a little bit of adjustment to this, just to make it a little bit more dynamic. Like I said, you can always turn the IK segments up, right? That'll give you more. Your brush size will determine things as well, right? So make your brush bigger, smaller, right? And of course, like I said, we can switch deformation to scale translate. You might want to make your brush size bigger again when you do the scale translate. And then, of course, Control. Control actually lets you properly move it to stretch it. You might find, like I said, that you'll kind of go back and forth a little bit, right? Kind of making minor adjustments. If you use face sets, you can do some other cool stuff with that. But like I said, I don't really want to go too nuts with this, and it's more just getting you guys to kind of see some basic stuff for it. There we go. And turn those segments down a lot, right? So keep in mind, right, that you can do some kind of neat stuff with posing if you wanted to a little bit. Make it a bit more dynamic. All right. So I'll hit 4 for object mode, right? And I can go back to shading, right? Of course, if you want to, you can actually go to the rendering, but that's where your render is going to finally be. So you go to shading, and I tend to kind of move this down, right? Because you can always kind of left-click drag that bar to move it down. And you now see there's kind of a bit of a pose to the character, right? In this case, I'm going to make sure in shading workspace to go to here and turn scene lights on, right? And now you can see that we get the full shadowing. We can see bloom's a little bit intense because of the floor, right? So I can always go back to here. Remember that little kind of briefcase guy? We can turn bloom off if we want to. I'm not sure if we're really going to need it for this one too much. It's our first one. But you can see how even in Eevee, you can start to get a really good idea that there's shadow casting, there's light intensity, right? You're even getting some kind of pseudo bounce light from the global illumination, right? Now, at this point, though, we really kind of want to finalize what our camera is going to look like. And we want to switch to cycles for our full render, right? So, just like I said, a little bit about kind of turning our light on and switching our light, right? The light's here. There's the green icon towards the bottom where you can change to sun. You can play with strength, color, if you want to have a little bit of color to it. Angle is the softness of the shadow. It's probably good at the default for now. And we put a floor plane in. Posing, like I said, there is a sculpt brush pose. Of course, you can rig characters and all that stuff, but sometimes if you're just trying to do some simple basic posing, you might find the pose brush is a kind of cool way to play with it a little bit. Like I said, I don't really need to see posing for your guys' stuff, but I figured, hey, it's good to have a video where you at least see a basic tool that you can kind of do to maybe tweak the legs a little bit so they're a little bit less static. Shading, though, is a good place to go. And what I like to do in shading, remember there's the little V over here, right? We've talked about it a bunch, the little V right here. I can click on that to open it up, right? And you see if I go to View, there is actually something called View Lock, right? Camera to View. And then if I go to View here, I can go to Cameras, and I could set Active Camera, and you can see that that's the actual camera itself, right? And what you could do is you can actually use your normal navigation to position it, right? So go to View, Cameras, Active Camera, and that'll actually go and use this camera right here, right? Remember, there's actually a camera in the scene right there. The reason I went to the little V here, right, that little V kind of in between the outliner and the kind of Blender's version of View Compass. If you click that open and go to View, there's Camera to View. And what that does is it sets your... it basically allows your camera and your normal navigation to align, right? So Alt left mouse button will rotate camera, Alt middle mouse button will move camera, Alt right mouse button will zoom. And that's a lot easier to position the view for me than otherwise. So there's kind of this little kind of cool thing when you click on V to get this up. You go to View, Camera to View. Then you go View, Cameras, Active Camera. And then you now actually have something to kind of set up your final render for. In this case, I'm now going to click on kind of the last ball, right? We know that this first ball is wireframe. That one's kind of solid shaded. That's material preview, basically Eevee, right? So if I go back to my the briefcase one, that kind of looks like a briefcase microwave, right? It's kind of right below the wrench and screwdriver one at the very top. It's like the second button down. You'll see the rendering engine is Eevee. That's what your material preview is using. The next one over, though, is proper rendering, right? So if I click on this, you'll actually see more of the real render. Now, at this point, though, it's going to use Eevee by default. So I actually want to switch the render engine, click on it, to Cycles. That's the formal full renderer inside of Blender. For us, because I don't really want us to sweat too much the background and all that stuff, I feel like that'll work pretty well for us, right? I might go on to the floor here, click on its material right there, right? And maybe do a new material for it. Turn on the color, maybe a grayer color. There we go. And if there's any specular, we could turn that down to 0 so it's not really reflecting at all. So I would honestly probably select your grid plane again, put a new material on there, right? It can just be that default material. Keep in mind, though, that it might play with some of these other features a little bit right there, right? This is going to be okay for us, though. Yeah. All right. So this will kind of start to get us kind of our basic rendering setup. We can go back up here. Cycles is on, right? I usually like to go to denoising here, right? So there's kind of if you click back on that kind of, like I said, microwave kind of briefcase thing, right? It brings this up, right? You switch to Cycles instead of Eevee. We go to denoising, right? And I'm going to turn it on for the renderer. You can turn off the viewport also, and you see how it just makes the render image a lot cleaner, right? So that's kind of cool. You can use what'll work. I find open image denoise works pretty well. So I'll kind of just use those, but there's a couple depending on how good your 3D card is. And now you can kind of start to see that we're getting the idea of what a final render is going to look like, right? We've got a shadow, a bit of bounce light, right, from the directional light hitting kind of the floor and bouncing some light up underneath it. And this just looks a bit cooler than it would as a normal kind of setup for it, right? We are getting a little bit of shader termination stuff here, but for our first render, I'm not going to worry about that, right? Well, like I said, we'll do a little more of advanced render for our later project. You have controls to kind of adjust that nowadays. I find sometimes it affects some of the other aspects as well. I think this will be good for what we want to do for this. And then when we're happy, what we do, and I'll just save this, we'll go to render, right? And you see at the very top of render is render image, right? So we'll click on that. And what it's going to do is it's actually going to bring up the full render. Now, in this case, I didn't set the actual render resolution, but it's it's HD, not 4K, but it's 1080 HD by default. I'll show you how to control that in a minute. Like I said, some of this shadowing you're getting here is just the model being low res. If you subdivide it, maybe added subdivisional surface modifier one more time, that would help that a lot. And we could easily make the mesh that much more dense if we wanted to. But like I said, there's actually a kind of a shader termination control feature as well, but I don't think we'll worry about that too much on this first project. We're just going to kind of let it finish up rendering. I mean, this is our warm-up project, right? It's kind of enough to get us good fundamentals for all of our stuff, even if we're not trying to, make it the prettiest version yet. But yeah, so once you're ready to render, you just go boom, you hit render, let it render out. And you see, this is a full render. So what it's doing is it's taking all of the information from your camera and how your camera's seeing the model, the light and how it's interacting with the colors and normal maps, as well as kind of the indirect global illumination that's already on to kind of bounce around. And then it says, hey, I can do these and turn these all into pixels, right? There we go. And I can close that up. And you notice if we go to rendering here, you'll actually see it right in there, right? So shading, we can kind of set up our camera, all that stuff. Rendering, you actually see the final render right here. And what you can do is you can go to image, right? And you can just hit save as, right? So if you want, you can just do image, save as, and then you can actually save this as your kind of final render, right? Crab, render. There we go. And now we actually have a final render for that. Now, if you wanted to make minor adjustments, like we said, if you wanted to, you could always maybe go in here. This probably could use a little more geometry anyways. You can always go back to your blue wrench, add modifier, right? Subdivision surface. And you notice how that rendering gets a lot better through there. So sometimes you get that kind of harsh lighting effect because there's less geometry, right? And I can easily just do kind of a quick apply all. And remember, if we actually look at that in face mode, our polygon count is not ridiculous, right? So if you wanted to add kind of one more subdivision level to these models and then do your final render, that is not a problem, right? That is not a problem. Kind of some cool stuff to know. Also, like we said, the third one down, right? The printer icon one, if you click on that, you'll see right here is your control of the resolution, right? By default, it's set to 1080. So you can kind of do that if you want to. If you wanted to kind of adjust that to be higher. I wouldn't recommend it because that'll go pretty large, right? If you want, right, you can actually go to the blue world, or sorry, red world, right? So kind of right below all the white ones is the red world. And you see that there is the ability to kind of adjust background stuff, right? So if I click on color here, you see how I could turn the color background up a little bit more, right? So if I didn't want my color background to be so dark, if you just go to kind of the red, really it looks like a world, right? It actually looks like a world icon with a slight line through its red. Right there in surface, there's background, right? This is, some of you guys remember from earlier some years, you can actually put a skylight in the background, but I think here we'll just keep it simple, right? Pick the color. And like I said, if we wanted to, we could just do a re-render, right? Re-render this, and now you'll see with all these settings, we can get a pretty cool render, right? The nice thing is there's no real art to do to the rendering. It's kind of like, hey, when you've got everything else done, turn a few settings on, get your camera set up the way you want to, and go. You'll notice how we get a lot less shadowing artifacts here with more geometry, right? So this is one of the things to consider, is that more geometry generally will create a nicer shading effect, right? Lower resolution models, there's kind of a terminator with the roundness of the polygons on a normal angle that can kind of be harsher. Generally, higher, more resolution for a model will allow it to render nicer. There are some controls Blender added more recently that allow us to change it. Let me look at those on our next project. But here, honestly, this is already really low res to begin with, not terribly dense, so we figured, hey, let's do one more resolution. And you see how it just looks more rounded now? And the normal mapping's kind of doing a lot of the extra details for us. And then, like I said, once we're kind of happy and the render's done, you see how we could change the color background a little bit, right? Once we like that, you'll notice you can actually go to image right here, right here from the render, and you can save right there as well, right? So I can go right there to save, and there's the earlier one, right? Save as, so it'll save over it. If you go to rendering here, and even compositing, you can do some cool stuff with that, but like I said, we're not going to get into that stuff quite yet for what we're doing here. But these are just some of the neat things you could do to kind of set things up, right? Remember, right here, you'll go in there, you can turn cycles on, turn on your image denoiser so it'll render the image cleaner with less noise. Camera to view is good. Remember your light, right? And then go to the green light bulb here. You can play with the strength. You can play with the position. View cameras, right? Active camera, and then we can kind of get your shot the way you like it. And like I said, you might even just apply an extra subdivision modifier to this, right? Kind of cool that way. And then, like I said, you know, that red ball, red world, you can change the kind of color here for your background, right? And then when you render it and save it, everything will be there. We did create an extra plane, right? Modeling, object mode. And you notice polygon count-wise, right, that total, we still only have like 15,000 triangles, right? So even with that extra subdivision surface, that didn't add a lot of polygons to this, right? And generally, you want more polygons to get better deformation anyways. We only try to be super efficient when we don't have the resources to do a denser model. And video game polygon counts now are, you know, pretty significant, particularly in the PS5, Xbox Series X age. And I just went add, mesh, you know, plane. Right, they give us a floor to have on there. Sculpting, that actually has the pose brush, so if you want to do a little bit of posing, you can. And then it kind of puts it all together into one neat kind of little package for us. All right, so I think that'll be a great kind of good starter basic video for you guys for how to get your final renders.